all of the tectonic activity going on during the flood. The ocean would have been much warmer, leading to more evaporation. There would have been a lot more cloud cover, aerosols from volcanic activity that would have made the summers cooler, which would have led to an ice age until things calmed down. And the estimate is that the ice age would have lasted probably about 700 years for the most part, with a peak at the 500-year mark after the flood. And so it was really probably finishing up by the time of Abraham. There's some debate over that. But one of the things we're going to talk about tonight here is one of the things that would have happened during the Ice Age. We talked about the Grand Canyon some yesterday, which is probably the most often used argument for an old earth, and we showed how creationists would explain that, how the evidence fits with the fact that the Grand Canyon was formed, the rock layers were formed during the flood, and then the carving of it came probably during the Ice Age. Caves are another area where people have made the argument that the existence of a cave is something that would take so long to form that the earth has got to be much older than the Bible would say. So for the last several years, I have been going into caves and studying those. This summer I got to over 60. I think I'm somewhere around probably 65 caves now that I've studied. And in particular, I'm studying solution caves of the U.S. So caves have, again, long been used as evidence of an old earth. And so we're tempted to think that they form when water is flowing underground, maybe eroding rock away by the movement of water, like a river would do a canyon. But that doesn't really fit the actual evidence. Solution caves or karst caves, these are the caves that most of us think of because they're the ones they make up most of the caves, and they have the pretty, what we call speleothems. That's your stalactites and stalagmites and cave bacon and all those items. Those caves have conventionally been argued to have formed slowly as rock dissolves from carbonic acid. And so the thinking is that rainwater drops to the ground, it picks up carbon dioxide in the air, it hits the ground and then starts soaking into the earth, and as the water seeps down through the earth, it picks up more carbon dioxide from decaying plants in the dirt, and then that turns the water into carbonic acid, which is the stuff in your soda that makes it fizz. It's a very weak acid, and so when that acid then sinks in the ground far enough, if it hits a kind of stone that dissolves more easily, like limestone, then that's where the cave will start forming. The acid slowly dissolves that rock because carbonic acid, again, is a weak acid, and so it'll eventually form this underwater hole, they say. That's the conventional thinking. And so secular geologists believe that, it would take thousands of years for these holes to get as big as some of our caves are. And so then when the water table lowers or the ground is uplifted from tectonic activity, the hole will drain of water, and then erosion on the surface of the earth will eventually uncover the cave. And so as you can imagine, all of that process would seem very slow and cause many Bible believers to scratch our heads trying to figure out what's going on here. So how do we explain what is going on from a biblical perspective? It's easy to just throw out there, well, we don't have to worry about it. God just created caves. Well, the problem is that caves are typically found in the rock layers that were formed not by God on day 3, but the flood rock layers. That's where these caves are found. So they didn't exist until the flood. And so it's also easy to say, well, okay, then the flood did it. But it's also just as easily for naturalists to say the Big Bang did it. I mean, it's much harder to actually gather evidence to prove something that you're arguing. Well, again, over the last several years, another kind of cave dissolution process has been discovered and is now being used even by the secular community to explain how many of these caves actually formed. It is now believed that over half of the caves that are out there were formed by this process, and that number continues to climb as geologists go back and reassess caves that have long been thought to be the carbonic acid dissolution caves. So instead of rocks being slowly dissolved by carbonic acid from above, now geologists are recognizing caves can be quickly dissolved from below by other stronger acids like sulfuric acid that are either pushed upward or come up due to heat. And so the process of this process is called hypogene speleogenesis. So in the case of sulfuric acid, as water comes into contact with rocks that will contain sulfur or dead plants and animals, which release sulfur as they decay. So you can imagine there's a lot of that going on in the flood. Or hydrogen sulfide that comes from the volcanic gases. Again, you got a lot of that going on during the flood. When that water then combines with oxygen, it forms sulfuric acid. And so during the flood, large amounts of this hot water would have been trapped below the surface of the earth with sporadic pockets of oxygen while dirt was being piled up on continents. And so the water would have mixed with oxygen as well as hydrogen sulfide from all the volcanic activity occurring during the flood and all the sulfur from dead plants and animals. And so the result would be sulfuric acid, and lots of it. And so the sulfuric acid would have been trapped beneath the Earth's surface. Since it was hot, it would have tended to move upward because heat rises. And so in addition to the pressure from above water and added dirt on the surface that would have caused the sulfuric acid to squeeze upward towards the surface due to forced flow, it's going to dissolve rock along the way. So bottom line, the flood conditions would have been perfect for the rapid formation of solution caves by sulfuric acid. Well, again, that is a good theory, but can we gather actual evidence that supports that theory and verifies that many caves were likely formed that way in the flood instead of slowly over thousands of years from carbonic acid processes? Well, definitely we can gather evidence. So to show that Hypogene speleogenesis explains most solution caves, I'm looking for characteristics in solution caves that would support ascending acid dissolution, the dissolving by acid, as the mechanism that formed these caves. So we're looking for entry holes at the base of the cave for acids to come up. Those are called feeders. You're looking for pathways that lead from the feeders upward to the top of the cave. These are called channels, and then dome structures at the top of the caves from acid pushing upward, not being able to escape. These are called cupolas. And without exception, every solution cave I have studied so far here in the east, which is the area where caves really haven't been reassessed yet, they have characteristics that support hypogene speleogenesis, exactly what we would expect if the flood happened and formed these caves rapidly only a few thousand years ago. Okay, but what about the Speleothem growth? So those are your stalactites and stalagmites, cave bacon, cave pearls, and so forth. These are called secondary features because they occur after the cave is already formed. So secular geologists argue that they only grow at about 0.01 cubic inches per year. So it would be 1 inch every century. Okay, but you've got some speleothems that are so huge. At that rate, it would take tens of thousands of years for them to form. And keep in mind, that's after the cave itself has already been formed. But even if the flood can explain the rapid dissolution of caves, then how could speleothems grow in just a few thousand years? Well, the answer, of course, is that geologists are assuming uniformitarianism, which we talked a lot about in our first session. They're assuming speleothems have always grown at the same rates we see them growing today. And the problem is that uniformitarianism, remember, does not fit the actual evidence when you study anything in geology, much less speleothem growth. So many factors play a role in how fast speleothems grow, including the level of carbon dioxide in the soil and the drip rate, the concentration of the droplets, the amount of rain at the surface of the air, the temperature of the cave, and many other things. And significantly, the Ice Age would have provided the exact conditions that would lead to fast Speleothem growth, which is why we're talking about this at this point. So during the Ice Age, there would have been, for example, much more rain on the surface, leading to faster drip rate in the cave, much higher levels of carbon dioxide in the soil from dead plants and animals from the flood, leading to more calcite and droplets, warmer caves due to the hotter rock layers after the flood, which would lead to faster evaporation and drier air in the caves. So all things that accelerate Speleothem growth, all conditions that would have been present during the Ice Age. Now, although estimates of flowstone growth, this is one of the Speleothems where you see the material kind of like, it looks like a waterfall going over a rock where it's frozen. You've probably seen that, maybe that kind of growth before. Those are called flowstone. Flowstone growth is on the order of, again, about 1 cubic inch per century. The actual empirical evidence doesn't fit that estimate, even today, much less during the Ice Age. Nearly every tour guide in my travels highlights the fact that that's what all the geologists say, is that a cubic inch every century, but they've noticed in their own cave that, that the Speleothems grow much faster, and that's common. And again, all these caves that I'm studying. So tour guides for Squire Boone Caverns in Mockport, Indiana, for example, showed me a stairwell leading down to the cave, and they know exactly when it was built, 1973, and so it was 46 years from when I visited. And then at 1 cubic inch per century, there should have been about a half of an inch of flowstone in the stairwell. And instead, flowstone covered much of the walls of this 73-step stairwell, and it was 2 to 3 inches thick in several places. So the size of Speleothems is not a problem for the young earth position that the Bible teaches. In coming years, I hope to expand further into the Northeast and then start looking at caves in the more Midwest. So the creationist ice advance theory may or may not be true. Again, this is a theory. We weren't there to actually witness this. But notice that this theory has great explanatory power where modern uniformitarian models fail to explain the evidence. So the biblical perspective, the creationist model, explains why you have a huge number of animal extinctions that only occurred once. Well, it's because there was just one ice age. It explains why you have, remember, the disharmonious associations of animals. Remember, where cold and hot environment animals are mixed together, living together. Well, it's because you've got milder winters and cooler summers, so it kept the animals relatively mixed. The evidence for wet deserts is explained by glacier growth. Animal dispersions from Asia to America across the Bering Strait is explained because you've got more water that would have been in the form of ice and clouds, which would have allowed access across the strait, plus ice bridges would have formed in various places, like connecting the England with over in like Normandy across the English Channel. The rapid formation of post-flood canyons is explained, as well as we explain the Grand Canyon that way. The rapid formation of Speleothems in caves is explained. The thickness of ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica that have been used to try to argue for an old Earth, that's explained by this as well. And of course, the biggest plus is that there's a clear-cut trigger to initiate the ice advance. Remember that the secular models don't have a trigger to explain how you even get one of them started, much less as many as 50, which is what many of them will argue. We would argue the flood would have necessitated this. If the flood happened, the ice age would have followed. All right, now jumping out of the science aspect back into the Bible here, while all that's going on with the ice age, which is fascinating, you have humanity reproducing after the flood, and not much is explained about that period immediately after the flood. There's really not even evidence archaeologically of writing at all for some time. Genesis 10 and 11 give genealogical information about those intervening centuries during what creation scientists theorize to be the ice advance period. And so it helps us to see why which line from Noah repopulated which areas of the world, but not much beyond that is known. From Seth to Abram, you have 10 generations, and once again, there is not any evidence of gaps there. Now that said, while there is no evidence of gaps in the lineup, it is notable that Moses' terminology in Genesis 11 is not exactly the same as what he uses in chapter 5. And when all the evidence is weighed, there's potentially room for a maximum of just a few hundred years beyond what we usually think is being stated there in Genesis 11 by Moses. But we can nail it down and know that we're not even talking about thousands, much less millions. And again, we've got an article on our website that addresses that if you're interested in studying that. But keep this in mind, when we stand back and look at the question of time and genealogies, even if Genesis 11 allowed for millions of years worth of time to be injected there through major gaps in the genealogies, it still wouldn't allow the Bible to fit the conventional evolutionary paradigm. And here's why. When you look at the actual fossil record as portrayed by evolutionists themselves, guess where you see humans showing up? The genus Homo, what we consider to be likely the human fossils, shows up at the very top. All right, the very top of the fossil record. Roughly, they would say 2 million years ago, based on the evolutionary time scale. Well, Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are genealogies, and both are genealogies of humans. So squeezing time into these genealogies only helps the very top of the fossil record, which isn't where evolution and deep time geology need its time. So the bulk of the fossil record is prior to humans from an evolutionary perspective. And so the immense amount of time that has to be accounted for to try to reconcile the Bible with an old earth is not going to be found in the genealogies of the Bible. Instead, it has to be squeezed into the text before humans are even on the scene. So basically, before day 6. In other words, you're going back to Genesis 1. But that can't be done because the Hebrew doesn't allow that. There's Moses' comments in Exodus 20:11, Jesus in Mark 10:6, Luke 11:50 through 51, Paul, Romans 1:20. Across the board, the Bible does not allow you to squeeze time into Genesis 1. So Genesis 11 is not going to help the evolutionist or the old earther try to figure out where to fit time. Now, how is this important from a scientific perspective? Well, the implication is that we can't nail down precisely when the flood or creation was by a specific year, based on the ancient way of handling this by Moses in particular. So the flood could have been, we say, anywhere between 2350 BC and a few centuries before that, and then creation would be 6,000 years ago or a few centuries beyond that, which is why we'll generally say creation was 6,000 to 8,000 years at most. All right, so moving forward, we probably at the time of Peleg, based on Genesis 10:25 and the surrounding scriptural context, you have Babel. And this could have been as early as 100 years after the flood, or a few decades later, according to the chapter 11 genealogy. So this would likely fall as the Ice Age is really gaining steam here, which might explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and spread out beyond the Middle East area, or why God chose to step in when he did, to make sure that the spread happened before the conditions of the Ice Age would have prevented passage to remote areas. So regardless, while there may have been several human languages before the flood, we don't really know how many languages there were before the flood. All of them would have been wiped out in the flood except for Noah's language. So by the time of Babel, that is still the only language being spoken, and then the language divisions at that point are supernaturally created by God, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth spread out from Palestine. And so notably, human fossils and archaeological artifacts don't appear in the flood, and we talked about this in a Q&A a couple nights ago. They don't appear in the flood layers or the pre-flood layers. They were all apparently wiped out in the flood. Possibly that entire habitat was subducted. Human fossils and artifacts don't appear until after the flood. Archaeologists study the artifacts and divide what they call early human history. We would say really just post-flood history, but when you go into archaeology, you study early human history, and they divide it into 3 ages: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And so the Stone Age would correlate roughly to what we would call post-flood, pre-Abraham. The Bronze Age roughly to Abraham, to David, and then the Iron Age from David to probably about Cyrus, about 550 BC. And so we would correlate the Stone Age, especially with the dispersion after Babel and the Ice Age. So archaeologists looking at the artifacts that have been dug up in those early post-flood sediments see evidence that humans were nomadic during that time. They're called hunter-gatherers. They're moving from place to place. And they believe they were doing that for thousands of years, of course, until they evolved to the point where they were intelligent enough to start settling and farming. They became more advanced. And we, of course, would interpret that evidence differently. First of all, they weren't nomadic for thousands of years, but possibly hundreds of years. But yes, we would agree that they were primarily nomadic. Why? Well, because after Babel, they're spreading out and filling the earth as God told them to do. And so they were nomads. It wasn't because they weren't intelligent enough to farm or hadn't evolved enough yet. It's that they were spreading out and filling the earth, Genesis 9:1. And so keep in mind that many of the Native Americans that the Europeans discovered in the 15th century were also nomads, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because they weren't inclined to put down roots in one place. And since they weren't staying put for very long, you wouldn't expect evidence of cities or even houses. Instead, you would find evidence, for example, that they would stay in tents in caves. And sure enough, cavemen are associated with the Paleolithic period of the Stone Age. So people were finding shelter in caves. Again, not because they weren't as intelligent, but because they didn't have time to put down roots. And then after a few hundred years, when they were spread out and began to get settled, different types of archaeological artifacts began surfacing, as more products are now being developed by humans that would be useful in a farming culture and in a culture that starts putting down roots. So this is what we call the Bronze Age, and it's during that time that you start finding evidence of writing. Could humans write before that, during the dispersion period? Well, possibly. We would expect they were certainly capable of that intellectually, but there simply may not have been much of a need for it. And so again, a good comparison may be the Native Americans of Northern America who were not writing when the Europeans encountered them, many of them. Instead, they drew pictures. They weren't writing, not because they lacked the intelligence to write, but because they had no interest in that. They had no need to develop written languages. And so keep in mind that although God miraculously made new verbal languages at Babel, humans may have had to develop the written forms of those languages over time. One final interesting point about the Ice Age: when did Job live? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, and there's a lot of debate about that, but there's some interesting puzzle pieces in the book which might shed some light on this subject. Various clues cause us to surmise that he lived after the flood. So, for example, a flood is mentioned by Eliphaz, and while floods happen a lot, I only know of one that is directly mentioned as being a punishment for wiping out wicked man, suggesting a post-flood date. Also, the text doesn't specifically reveal, God mentions the recesses of the deep in Job 38:16, and those apparently are the deep sea trenches that are found on the bottom of the ocean, which are at subduction zones, for example, which we know formed during the flood. So there's a little hint there. The text doesn't, so the text doesn't come out and specifically tell you Job's age when he died. Job 42:16 tells us he lived 140 years after the events described in the book. So how old was he when all of that began? Well, he's old enough to have had 10 apparently grown children, Job 1:4. which suggests that he may have been 50, 60, or even older than that, which would mean he was possibly at least 200 years old. And so that age was described there in Job 42:17. That age is described as being old and full of days, even though we're only talking about 200 years or so, which wouldn't have described Job if he lived prior to the flood. That wouldn't have been considered old and full of days, because people were living to be over 900 years old. So when you consider that Terah, Abraham's father, lived to be 205, and Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac lived to be 180, Jacob lived to be 147, then we see Job's age fitting nicely around the time of Abram. All right, several names are mentioned in Job, which were likely named after individuals mentioned in the post-flood period, there in Genesis 10, and that argues for Job living post-flood as well. And those same names argue for his living during the pre-Mosaic period in the patriarchal age. Sources outside of the Bible also verify some of those names as being from the second millennium BC, around the time of Abraham. Also, no mention is made of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain, though it surely would have been known to the inhabitants of Uz. While again, the flood is mentioned in the book, as would be expected, you don't see Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned, which suggests a pre-Sodom and Gomorrah time period. Also arguing for a pre-Mosaic patriarchal time, Job is described as offering sacrifices for his family, which is a patriarchal custom that occurred throughout the time before Moses, and his wealth is measured not in money, but livestock and possessions. Also, God talks directly to Job in chapters 38 through 42, as he did to the patriarchs prior to Moses. Also, no mention is made of anything pertaining to the law of Moses or the events affecting the Israelites in Egypt or Canaan, even though Uz, where Job lived, is thought to be in that neck of the woods, suggesting that Job lived pre-Moses. In fact, his daughters are given an inheritance at the end of the book of Job, which was not customary during the Mosaic period. Also, a kind of money is mentioned in Job, which dates back to the pre-Mosaic patriarchal period as well, and also the style of the book matches other writings that date to the second millennium BC. So these and other factors suggest that the events of Job took place at the time of Abraham, possibly on the tail end of the Ice Age. So with that in mind, it's interesting to note that cities are mentioned as existing in the book. And interestingly, there are no known cities in Ice Age rock layers, which are the Pleistocene layers. Cities don't show up until the higher rock layers of the Holocene, where Abraham must have lived, because cities are clearly in existence during his time. The 5 cities of the plains are just one example. But I could only find one reference to cities in the book of Job, which isn't really typical of other Bible books relating historical accounts. Instead, lands are described, or individual people who eventually had cities or lands named for them. And so Job might have lived on the tail end of the Ice Age and Babel dispersion, transitioning into the time period when cities were being planted, with his life perhaps overlapping with that of Abraham. Interestingly, snow and ice are also mentioned several times in the book, even though snow would have likely been even rarer in Uz then than it is today in Florida, it being so close to the equator. So why would snow and ice have been such a hot topic in Job? And again, it would fit with Job having lived around the time of the Ice Age. So assuming so, then the book of Job tells us much about the mindset of mankind at that time, as well as the animal kingdom at that time, including the mention of Behemoth, which most closely matches the description of a sauropod dinosaur, and Leviathan, which is possibly a large type of large marine reptile like a mosasaur, plesiosaur, something like that. All right, so as we wrap up the session I intended to finish yesterday, consider once again the flood. Jesus called the attention of his audience back to the flood in Matthew 24. He said, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. You know, it's important to study the works of the Lord, like the flood, is it not? According to Jesus, he pointed back to that event to teach us something. It's important to study the works of the Lord. It's crucial that humanity not forget the significance of this event. The flood, if you think about it, is a physical depiction of what God thinks about sin. You know, whenever we see a high mountain and we think, oh, wow, that's so beautiful, the Smoky Mountains, those are so beautiful, it's dangerous to forget why that mountain actually exists. The existence of a mountain is evidence of extreme violence that God unleashed on this earth because of the wickedness of man. The flood is a reminder that we serve a holy God and the necessity of human repentance if we want to please him. It's a reminder that judgment can always be around the corner when we least expect it. We're supposed to learn that from a study of the flood. But also it's a reminder that those who, like Noah, have obedient faith in God, they can be saved through water, just like he did, and receive the benefits of God's grace. 1 Peter 3:20-21, once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, right, 120 years he waited. There's the grace of God towards all of humankind there, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There's also an antitype which now saves us. Baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. So baptism through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's interesting that, again, God chose to use the flood in that way to remind us about things that he did, things that we're supposed to remember about him. It reminds us about his holiness, his judgment. It also reminds us about his grace. But his grace is always conditional. All the way through the Bible, it was always conditional. Would Noah have received God's grace if he hadn't obeyed God and made the ark and gotten on the ark? No, he wouldn't have. He would have drowned with the rest of the world. The kind of faith that is a saving faith. See, there's 2 kinds of faith in the Bible. You got the faith that even the demons have, James chapter 2. That's not a saving faith. You have the living kind of faith that is always a faith that is coupled with obedience. Romans 1:5 and 16:26 call it obedient faith, a faith that springs from, obedience that springs from faith is what it actually means in the Greek there. And so that is always the kind of faith that will save you. And that is exactly the kind of faith that Noah had. He had a faith in God that actually acted. And that's the kind of faith that always saves you. Would the walls of Jericho fallen if the Israelites had not obediently gone around? You know, if they just said, okay, God, we believe you, would the walls have fallen? No, they had to obey. That's always been the prescription. In the Hall of Faith there in Hebrews chapter 11, one after the other, you see examples of people that had faith, and it's always coupled with obedience. It's amazing to me that so much of the religious world around us refuses to accept that principle. They just cannot allow themselves to accept that they have to be obedient to be saved. And yet, look, it's what the Bible teaches. It's not like we, I want it to be that way. It's just the way it is. We got to let the Bible teach these things. It's amazing how much the Bible has to say about all of this, and yet we can be so blind because of our own preconceived ideas, just like the secular world around us can be. They can be so blind on this subject of evolution and the flood and creation, they just will not accept the evidence on it. And we do the same thing if we're not careful. If we don't let the evidence speak for us, especially the Bible, let the Bible tell us what God believes about these things. That we cannot expect to have it any different than anybody else throughout history who refused to believe God and do it the way he said to do it. Isn't that a sad commentary, though, on the religious world? The world at large, the billions and billions of people that have ever lived, the bulk of them said, nope, God, don't want any of it. Remember, there was at least 215 million people on the planet before the flood, and only 8 people got out of it. And remember, Jesus said, most people, right, are going to choose the broad, easy way, Matthew 7:13 through 14. It's a few people that are willing to walk that straight and narrow path. Why? Because it's straight. It's like a straitjacket. It's rigid, and people don't want that. Right? And so they will be lawless. Oh, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Cast out many. I will declare to them, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. If you're unwilling to obey what God's law says, you can't expect him to save you. You can't call Jesus your Lord and not do what he tells you to do. Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord, Lord? Do not do the things that I say. He's always expected obedience of us. All right, a lot more we could say about that. I am not going to go ahead and dig into the next session. What the next session was, what I intended that to be is basically the apologetic side of this whole question. We were going to study what do people say in response to this? People like Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, as I call him. What does he say in response to all this stuff? And I encourage you to get flooded or go to our website and check out a lot of that material where I cover every argument I've ever heard on the subject. But I want to go ahead and take time now for the next 15 minutes to let you ask some questions. You may even have some of those questions that I address in there, and this would be a good time to deal with that subject if you have anything. And by the way, I covered some of that material last fall as well, if you go back and look for the series that I presented here. It was that Wednesday series that was on several Wednesdays there. I forgot when that was. Was it September, October? I don't remember. Okay, yeah, and so at least one of those sessions was really devoted to a lot of that material, if you'd like to see some of that. Yes. What's that? Okay, so a solution cave is just the name. There's different kinds of caves, and a cave that is a solution cave is a cave that forms from acids dissolving rock. That's what a solution cave is. It's also called a karst cave with a K, karst cave, and so you'll see that term. And so most caves are solution caves. They're just argued to be from carbonic acid, which is not correct based on all the studies I'm doing on this subject. There's DeSoto, which is now renamed, right? It's actually just changed this year to something else. And there is one around Huntsville, one just north of Birmingham. I think there's actually maybe 4 in Alabama. I forgot what the other one was. I'd have to go back and look at my list. What's that? Cathedral, yeah. Is that an? I've been to Cathedral. I forget which state it was in though. Okay, so I've been to all the caves that are commercial caves in Alabama, Tennessee, Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, North Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, Virginia, and West Virginia. This summer there were 2 that were closed, but so I'm covering it all the ones that just so nobody can argue. Well, that's just an exception to the rule. No, this is across the board. These caves were formed quick. There's powerful evidence of that. The one at Lookout Mountain, isn't that Ruby Falls there? Yes, that's another one. Now, in the case of Ruby Falls, they actually have a waterfall there that, as I recall, they actually use an electric pump to push water up there for the waterfall. It's actually not real. Sorry to bust your bubble if anybody thought that, but I pressed the tour guide about that because there'd be geologic significance to that if there really was water pouring down there. Yeah. Say that again? Oh, yeah. So I went out there to Carlsbad early on because it is, the caves out west are already acknowledged to be Hypogene Speleogenesis, including Carlsbad. And an interesting story on Carlsbad, I went to Carlsbad right after I had been trained in how to study these caves. And so I went to Carlsbad just to kind of test and see if I'd be able to see the features. And I was having trouble seeing the features until it hit me. Kurt Wise had always said to me that when you're thinking about the flood, you have to think bigger in everything. In geology, you have to think bigger. The geologists today tend to think local. They think too small. From a flood perspective, you got to think big. We're finding seismites that are big. And so I remember that hitting me when I was in I think they call it like the big room in Cathedral, or in Carlsbad, and it hit me, wait a minute. And I looked up and realized I was in a room that was basically a massive cupola that was just bigger than a stadium. And so I thought, well, if that's the case, then there should be a feeder that goes down deep. Where's that feeder? And I went over and looked, and there was like a house-size hole in the ground that like dropped out of off somewhere down below. I couldn't see with my flashlight where it even went. So exactly what I would expect. So Carlsbad is one of those that's acknowledged to be hypogene. And I went to Grand Canyon Caverns out there as well, close to Grand Canyon. But most of my work is over here because that's the caves that have not been reassessed. Everybody's still calling those carbonic. And now all the caves I go to, and I always end up talking to the tour guides because they're always curious what I'm doing with a flashlight and taking notes and everything. And so I always get to tell them, no, I explained to them how you can tell if it's Hypogene Speleogenesis, and they're all like, oh, wow, they're very receptive to it, and I'm kind of excited about it because I'm going to all these caves, and if they all change their narrative, it would be a big win for creation science. Does somebody else have a hand up? Oh, yeah, Mammoth Cave. I have been to Mammoth 2 or 3 times. I have not gone back to study it from this perspective because every time I go now, it's always packed. But I have studied it through paper and have seen it also has those features, but I haven't actually got to go see them with my eyes. The tour that I want to go on there, again, COVID and all has made it where they don't have a lot of their tours on. They're always packed. But I'm confident it has. I've hit all of the caves around that. There's a bunch. I mean, in Kentucky's like Swiss cheese. I mean, you feel like you could fall down through the earth at any moment. There's so many caves there. Just like in Missouri, there's a ton out there too. But I hit all the caves that are basically right around Mammoth. And Mammoth is Mammoth. I mean, it's a massive underground system that goes. They probably haven't even explored all of it. It may even connect to a lot of the caves I've looked in already. So there's some debate about that. Where is Scottsboro? I don't even know where that is. Well, there are 2 or 3 up that way. Yeah. One near what? Grant. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first question, I've already forgotten what it is. I did. I was gone from the house for 3 straight weeks, and I came back and went straight to this VBS. So my brain is working at like half power here. What was your first question? I've already forgotten. Yes. Okay. What is their response to it? Again, a lot of times most of the time, I would say they're either people that they either don't. You can tell they don't really care. Or they are people that are like, yeah, like I've run into people where they know that the Speleothems grow faster and they don't hide it. Or they'll hear me talk about it and then they'll go, oh, you know what? I think that's what it is in our cave too. And then I'll hear that. Rarely is it the case that I actually have people that push back and say, no, this is, yeah. So that's actually, a positive thing. I don't get a lot of pushback. Of course, they may push back if they didn't think I knew what I was talking about. They may be more likely to do that. And your other question, I travel all over and speak on this kind of stuff and present. I was even over in England a few years ago, got to present out there. But there's one session I like to do in my evolution seminar where I get at the root of what is it, why, if the evidence is so clearly against evolution and for creation, then why is the bulk of really the world not accept it? And that's what that whole session is about, because the Bible has a lot to say about that question. And ultimately, it comes down to one principle that's not a very politically correct idea, and that is that the bulk of the world, and it gets at what I was just talking about a few moments ago, most people are unwilling to accept the evidence on this because of some other reason. In other words, if you were to sum in just a couple words, they're not genuinely interested, they're not sincerely interested in the truth. And we know that has got to be the case because Jesus said, anybody that knocks, the door's going to be opened. If you're seeking, you will find. Okay, so if the bulk of the world does not find, what does that mean according to Jesus? They're not seeking. And it doesn't matter if they might appear on the surface to be seeking. Most of us throughout history have not really genuinely been interested in the truth. We like the truth when it's convenient, but the minute it goes against something that we don't like, then we'll reject it. And it could be the age of the earth. It could be a bunch of things. It could be baptism. There's so many specific little things it could be that when we look out at the religious world around us, the things that cause people to do what they do, there'll be some little thing. Maybe it's the idea that, no, I had family members that died and they didn't do that. And so I'm just not going to accept that they are not saved. Okay, well, that's not a genuine interest in the truth. You have to let the Bible tell you the truth. You can't let your biases affect what you believe, or you're doing the same thing that everybody else throughout history has done. You got to imagine, think about Noah preaching. You think all the people he preached to were genuinely interested in the truth? And you know that they would have had their arguments against him. But the bottom line is they were unwilling to accept what he was preaching. This preacher of righteousness, they were unwilling for their own reasons. And this is a danger we can all fall victim to. Even, all of us that, we're here, we think that we're all, good to go, and we're here when nobody else is, out there. We're concerned about spiritual things. We better assess ourselves because the Bible makes it clear that even in the church described in the New Testament, most of them are going to be lost too because they're lukewarm. I mean, just look at the book of Revelation where you have these specific churches mentioned, and the entire congregations are being threatened to have their lampstand removed because of the lukewarmness and the lack of zeal about dealing with sin in the camp and so forth. We can all be, and the whole time, that all those people at that congregation were thinking, yeah, we're very spiritual people. We got this right. Well, we better stop and assess ourselves and make sure that we really have the obedient faith described in the Bible, because very few ever have had that. And so if we're too quick to think that we're being open-minded about what the Bible teaches on this, then we'll find ourselves in a fix. Okay, I'm seeing my PowerPoint here that I don't see it up there. That's a good slide, Jamie, whatever you got going on there. What else we got? Did I answer your questions? We good? Okay. I will say this, I travel around and speak a lot, and the target audience that I really want to talk to are the teens, the college age, because, a lot of people don't realize that the statistics show that 4 out of 10 of the people in the Lord's church, when they leave home, are leaving the church. And half of those are leaving the church over the stuff we're talking about this week. They become irreligious because what they have been told all the way through school, day in and day out for 18 years, is that the Bible is kooky and unenlightened. It's got contradictions. It's unscientific. You got to have a blind faith. And over here, this is the truth. And they get that every day, and it's chipping away at them. And so that's the people that are so important to me to be here. I need the high school, the teens here. I need the college age, and I need the people my age, Gen X, because we ate that stuff every day. And where I'm going with this is, it's depressing to me that when I do these seminars, the bulk of the people that show up, guess who they are? It's not those. They're lost in the world already. They got other things that are more important to them. The people that come are the older folks who don't even really see as much of the value of what I'm doing here. Because to them, they didn't need this stuff to be saved. I hear that a lot. I don't understand why we need this stuff. I didn't need that. They don't understand that we're losing the church over this stuff. And those are the people we need here. I really commend this congregation. I've been very impressed with this VBS, how you guys have gotten the word out about this and really brought in a lot of kids to hear this stuff. I'm excited about that. But that's an exception to the rule, sadly, and we're feeling it. We're getting hit over this hard. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I tell you, we appreciate y'all's prayers for us. And even, not just prayers, but we appreciate any assistance you guys give us financially, because we're a nonprofit organization. Like, I don't get paid for these books or anything. We've got to get this material out there. And that's what we're trying to do. And we got to try to get it as cheap as possible. And that's where donations really come in and help. We don't sell. This flooded book, if you were to find something like this on the market today, how much do you think this would cost to have this? I don't know if any of y'all looked through this book, this full color book that has all this kind of information here. Anybody have a guess? You don't have to do much research to see how much a book that's that big would cost out there. Probably about 2 times as much as we're offering. And the only way we can do that is through assistance from brethren helping us. But your prayers are very much coveted by us too. I mean, most people don't realize the kind of pushback we're getting in our day-to-day efforts, and it can be discouraging because people tend to fight you more than they'll pat you on the back. And so, we do that for each other at AP, and that's good. But we really don't get a lot of positive. We get a lot of the scoffers coming out of the woodworks coming at us. And so we appreciate y'all's prayers and encouragement, because it would be easy to say, you know what, I'm going to go do something that pays more. Yes, sir. There are sporadic individual young earth creation professors that I don't think they're even probably allowed to vocally say the truth about these things, but they're actively doing research that supports it. But most of the creation scientists that are professors in colleges they're in more private Christian universities, or they're in the public state universities and just keeping their head down. And there's a lot of that. Yeah. You mentioned the Art Creationism, the Speleothems folks of the whole Kenyan organization. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Now, I work with the scientists at Answers in Genesis behind the scenes, but Answers in Genesis, like you said, there's a few theological significant differences that make them not friendly to us. I say them, it's really probably Ken Ham at the top, really. But 99.9% of the stuff that they've got there, I have no problem with. It is on target. And people don't even realize how on target it is, because if you don't study the science of it, you don't even understand how good the material is there. I mean, now I went and sat down with one of their money guys to figure out what would it take to build that. Like if I wanted to do a museum down here, and the Creation Museum was $45 million. And the Ark Encounter was over $100 million to do that. And it's like, yeah, I'd like to see 1 million at AP. I mean, we could do some good with 1 million, much less that. So how in the world do you get money like that? And so he said, well, we have a massive mailing list. It's very cross-denominational. You know, if you have a mailing list that's that big and everybody sends in $20, you get money to be able to do things like that. And he said there were a few people that gave $1 million here or there, but mostly it was a bunch of people giving $20. So he had recommended building your mailing list, which we try to do. We try to get people to sign up, and so that we could do that kind of thing if we needed to. But anyway, we nowhere near have the kind of money that they would have to do that. So yeah, collaborating with them on things. Again, behind the scenes, I study and work with their scientists, but doing anything more like bigger. What I'd like to do is get Flooded and a couple other books to be sold by them. And since I have an in with the scientists, I'm working on being able to do that. We'll see what happens with it. All right, we're already a little bit over. So if you have any other questions you want to come talk to me, feel free to. Otherwise, let's stop and you can get some snacks. Thank you all for having me. Appreciate it. Enjoyed being here. Oh, and don't forget that I've got these books up here if anybody wants to get them. I'll be taking them tonight.